The conference room in downtown Seattle fell deadly silent. A $2 billion international merger between tech giants hung by a thread as the lead translator collapsed mid-negotiation, leaving Korean executives unable to communicate with their American counterparts. CEO Selene Caraway, stunning in her Armani blazer and diamond-studded watch, watched in horror as months of preparation crumbled before her eyes. Then, from the corner where she sat quietly beside her janitor father, came a clear, confident voice. "Excuse me, I can help translate." Everyone turned to stare at 12-year-old Ivy Merrick, who had just spoken fluent Korean. What happened next would not only save the biggest corporate deal in the company's history, but would shatter the walls between two completely different worlds. This is the incredible true story of how a struggling single father's remarkable daughter, who could speak 12 languages, prevented a corporate catastrophe that would have cost thousands of jobs, and how 3 broken people found their way to becoming an unlikely family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The 47th floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Seattle housed the most important business negotiation in TechFlow Industries' 30-year history. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Elliott Bay, while inside the mahogany-paneled conference room, tension crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. The merger between TechFlow Industries and Seoul-based quantum computing giant Hantech Corporation represented more than just a business deal. It was the key to technological supremacy in the rapidly evolving world of artificial intelligence. $1 billion hung in the balance. Not just money, but the livelihoods of over 15,000 employees across both companies, the future of American technological competitiveness, and the dreams of investors who had bet everything on this moment. The deal had been 18 months in the making, involving teams of lawyers, financial analysts, and technology specialists from both sides of the Pacific Ocean. Selene Caraway sat at the head of the massive conference table, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming silently against the polished wood surface. As CEO of TechFlow Industries, she had built her reputation on closing impossible deals, on finding solutions when others saw only obstacles. Her Armani blazer, tailored to perfection, spoke of success and authority, while her diamond-studded Cartier watch caught the morning light filtering through the windows. Every detail of her appearance had been carefully chosen to project confidence and control. Across from her sat the delegation from Hantech Corporation, 5 executives whose calm expressions masked the enormous pressure they faced back home. Their CEO, Mr. Park Seung-ho, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, had flown directly from Seoul for these final negotiations. The cultural weight of this moment pressed heavily on everyone present. Failure would mean not just financial loss, but a loss of face that would resonate throughout the Asian business community. The morning had begun with promise. Technical specifications had been reviewed, patent agreements had been finalized, and the complex financial arrangements that would govern the merger had been carefully structured by teams of international lawyers. The Korean delegation had expressed satisfaction with the technological capabilities of TechFlow's quantum processing division, while the American team had been impressed by Hantech's revolutionary approaches to quantum entanglement applications. But now, with less than 2 hours remaining before the signing ceremony that had been scheduled to coincide with the opening of Asian markets, disaster struck with the suddenness of a lightning bolt. Dr. Margaret Chun, the highly experienced simultaneous interpreter who had been facilitating communication between the two teams for the past 3 days, suddenly clutched her chest and collapsed onto the Persian carpet that covered the conference room floor. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted in the room. Dr. Chun was conscious but clearly in distress, her face pale and her breathing labored as they carefully moved her onto a stretcher. The preliminary diagnosis was a heart attack, likely brought on by the stress of the high-stakes negotiations and the irregular schedule she had been maintaining for weeks. As the elevator doors closed behind the medical team, taking Dr. Chun to Harborview Medical Center, a profound silence settled over the conference room. The Korean executives exchanged worried glances among themselves, speaking in rapid Korean that none of the American team could understand. Without a qualified interpreter, the intricate final negotiations that required precise understanding of technical terminology, legal implications, and cultural nuances had become impossible. Selene felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. The merger agreement contained dozens of complex clauses that required exact translation, not just of words, but of concepts that carried different legal weight in American versus Korean corporate law. The liability structures, the intellectual property transfers, the employment protection agreements for workers in both countries, all of these required the kind of nuanced understanding that only a highly trained professional interpreter could provide. Mr. Park leaned forward, his expression grave as he spoke to his colleagues in Korean. Even without understanding the words, everyone in the room could sense the urgency and concern in his voice. The Hantech team had traveled halfway around the world for this moment, but they could not sign agreements they did not fully understand. Their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, their legal obligations under Korean corporate law, and their personal integrity all demanded complete clarity. Before any signatures were placed on the documents, Selene's assistant, Jennifer, had been frantically working her phone since the moment Dr. Chen collapsed, reaching out to every professional translation service in the Pacific Northwest. The responses were uniformly disappointing. The few interpreters with the necessary qualifications were either already committed to other assignments or were located too far away to arrive in time. Those who were available lacked the specialized knowledge of quantum computing terminology and international corporate law that this negotiation required. The clock on the conference room wall seemed to tick with increasing loudness as precious minutes slipped away. In Seoul, it was already tomorrow morning, and the Hantech board of directors was waiting for confirmation that the deal had been completed. Stock markets would open soon, and any delay would require public disclosure that could send both companies' share prices plummeting. The ripple effects would extend far beyond the two corporations, affecting suppliers, partners, and the thousands of families whose financial security depended on the stability of these major employers. Selene stood up slowly, her mind racing through increasingly desperate options. Could they postpone the signing ceremony? The Korean executives had tight schedules and visa limitations that made extended stays problematic. Could they proceed with the portions of the agreement that had already been translated? The interconnected nature of the merger documents meant that incomplete execution could create legal vulnerabilities that would haunt both companies for years to come. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. As CEO, she bore ultimate accountability for the success or failure of this deal. The board of directors, the shareholders, the employees, the customers who depended on the technological innovations this merger would enable, all of them were counting on her to find a solution. But for the first time in her professional career, Selene Caraway found herself facing a problem that seemed to have no solution. The Korean executives began gathering their documents, their body language suggesting preparation for departure. Mr. Park spoke quietly to his team, and while his words remained incomprehensible to the American negotiators, his tone conveyed regret and disappointment rather than anger. They understood that this situation was beyond anyone's control, but understanding did not change the reality that they could not proceed without proper translation services. In that moment of crisis, as 2 years of work and $2 billion in value seemed about to evaporate, nobody in that conference room could have imagined that salvation would come from the most unlikely source possible. Sitting quietly in the corner beside her father, who had been called in that morning to repair a malfunctioning projection system, was a 12-year-old girl who was about to change everything. Jonas Merrick had never imagined that his life would unfold in the basement maintenance rooms and service corridors of Seattle's most prestigious office buildings. At 41 years old, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to measure success not in dollars earned but in promises kept to the people he loved most. His weathered hands told the story of countless nights spent fixing broken systems, his calloused fingers a testament to the physical demands of keeping the technological infrastructure of corporate America running smoothly. The maintenance uniform he wore each day, navy blue with his name embroidered above the pocket, represented more than just a job. It was his lifeline, his pathway to providing stability for his daughter in a world that seemed designed to favor those born into privilege. The uniform was always impeccably clean, pressed with military precision despite the demanding nature of his work. He understood that in environments where appearances mattered, even a janitor's credibility could be influenced by attention to such details. Jonas worked the night shift at TechFlow Industries, arriving each evening as the executives departed to their suburban homes and luxury condominiums. From 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., he moved through the empty corridors like a guardian spirit, ensuring that the building's complex systems continued functioning seamlessly. He cleaned executive bathrooms, emptied trash cans filled with discarded reports worth millions of dollars, and maintained the sophisticated technology that kept the company connected to global markets 24 hours a day. His expertise extended far beyond basic janitorial duties. Jonas had developed an intuitive understanding of the building's electrical systems, its heating and cooling infrastructure, its network connectivity requirements, and its security protocols. When sophisticated equipment malfunctioned, he was often the first person called to diagnose problems that stumped expensive consultants. His recommendations carried weight with the building management team, who had learned to trust his judgment about complex technical issues. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Jonas's real expertise lay in invisibility. He had perfected the art of moving through corporate spaces without disturbing the important people who conducted their business there. He understood the unspoken rules that governed his interactions with executives, the careful balance between helpfulness and deference that allowed him to maintain employment in a world where working-class people were often viewed as expendable resources rather than human beings with families and dreams. The morning of the merger negotiations, Jonas had been called in during his normal sleeping hours to address an emergency repair situation. The main conference room's projection system had developed a critical malfunction that threatened to disrupt the presentations planned for the Korean delegation. The sophisticated audiovisual equipment required specialized knowledge to diagnose and repair, and Jonas's reputation for solving complex technical problems had made him the obvious choice for the emergency call. He had faced an impossible choice that morning, one that highlighted the precarious nature of working-class family life in modern America. His daughter Ivy was recovering from a severe bout of influenza that had kept her home from school for 3 days. At 12 years old, she was mature enough to be left alone for short periods, but Jonas's protective instincts rebelled against leaving her while she was still weak and vulnerable. Their apartment in the Belltown district of Seattle represented the best accommodation Jonas could afford on his maintenance worker's salary. The one-bedroom space in a converted warehouse building was small but clean, with high ceilings and large windows that made it feel more spacious than its actual square footage suggested. Jonas slept on a pull-out couch in the living room, giving Ivy the bedroom and the privacy that a growing girl needed. The rent consumed nearly 60% of Jonas's monthly income, leaving little margin for unexpected expenses or the kind of extras that many families took for granted. Every purchase required careful consideration, Every expense weighed against the family's long-term financial stability. Yet Jonas had never allowed their economic limitations to diminish Ivy's sense of possibility or self-worth. He had learned to be creative with entertainment, turning trips to the public library into adventures and transforming walks through Pike Place Market into cultural explorations. The relationship between Jonas and his daughter had been forged in the crucible of shared loss and mutual dependence. Ivy's mother, Sarah, had died in a car accident when Ivy was 7 years old, transforming Jonas from a husband and father into the sole provider and caretaker for a traumatized young girl. The grief had nearly destroyed both of them, creating a period of several months when simply getting through each day required enormous effort and determination. But gradually, slowly, they had built a new version of family life that honored Sarah's memory while creating space for healing and growth. Jonas had learned to braid hair by watching YouTube videos, had mastered the preparation of the healthy meals that growing girls required, and had developed the emotional skills necessary to guide Ivy through the complex feelings that accompanied adolescence and the loss of a parent. Their evening routine had become a sacred ritual that provided structure and connection in their sometimes chaotic world. Jonas would return from his night shift at 6:30 in the morning, often exhausted from 8 hours of physical labor, to find Ivy preparing for school with the independence that single-parent families often require from their young people. They would share breakfast together, usually simple fare like oatmeal or toast, but prepared and consumed with attention and gratitude. In the evenings, before Jonas departed for work, they would spend time together reviewing Ivy's homework, discussing her school experiences, and sharing the small but significant events that had shaped their respective days. These conversations had deepened over the years, evolving from simple check-ins to sophisticated discussions about everything from mathematics and science to philosophy and human nature. Jonas had always been amazed by his daughter's intellectual curiosity and her remarkable ability to absorb and process complex information. While other parents worried about their youngsters spending too much time on electronic devices or social media, Jonas found himself struggling to keep up with Ivy's voracious appetite for learning. She read constantly, not just the books assigned by her teachers, but additional materials she discovered in the library or found through online research. Her interest in languages had emerged naturally from her broader curiosity about different cultures and ways of thinking. Jonas had initially been puzzled by her fascination with foreign language instruction videos and international news broadcasts, but he had learned to support her interests even when he couldn't fully understand them himself. He spent money they could barely afford on language learning software and international magazines, recognizing that his daughter's gifts represented possibilities that he wanted to nurture despite their financial limitations. The morning of the merger crisis. As Jonas prepared to leave for the emergency repair call at TechFlow Industries, he faced the familiar dilemma that confronted single parents everywhere. His daughter was still recovering from her illness, not quite ready to return to school, but no longer requiring constant supervision. The repair job was urgent and well paid, offering the kind of overtime compensation that could help them build a small financial cushion for future emergencies. Ivy, with the wisdom that often develops in young people who have been forced to mature beyond their chronological age, understood her father's dilemma without requiring detailed explanation. "I can come with you, Dad," she said simply. "I'll bring my books and stay out of the way. I promise I won't cause any problems." Ivy Merrick possessed a gift that defied easy explanation and challenged the assumptions adults typically made about intellectual development in young people. At 12 years old, she could speak 12 languages with varying degrees of fluency, ranging from native-level proficiency in English and conversational Spanish to working knowledge of Mandarin, Korean, Japanese, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Russian, Arabic, and Hindi. Her linguistic abilities weren't the result of formal instruction or expensive private tutoring. but rather the product of an extraordinary natural aptitude combined with insatiable curiosity about human communication. Her fascination with languages had begun during the difficult period following her mother's death, when 7-year-old Ivy had discovered that foreign language videos on the internet could transport her to different worlds where grief felt less overwhelming. Initially, she had been drawn to the musical qualities of different languages, the rhythmic cadences of Spanish, the tonal complexities of Mandarin, the flowing sounds of Italian vowels. But gradually she began to understand that each language represented a unique way of organizing thoughts and expressing emotions. Unlike most students who struggled with vocabulary memorization and grammar rules, Ivy approached language learning with the intuitive pattern recognition that some people possess for mathematics or music. She could identify linguistic structures almost instinctively, recognizing how different cultures used language to convey concepts that might not exist in other linguistic traditions. She understood that some languages were more precise about spatial relationships, while others offered more nuanced ways to describe emotional states or social hierarchies. Her learning process was entirely self-directed and remarkably efficient. She would begin by listening to native speakers through online videos, podcasts, and international news broadcasts, training her ear to recognize the sounds and rhythms that characterized each language. Then she would gradually begin to identify recurring words and phrases, building vocabulary through context and repetition rather than formal study. Grammar emerged naturally from her exposure to correctly structured sentences, and she developed an intuitive sense of syntax that allowed her to construct original statements without conscious attention to rules. What made Ivy's abilities truly extraordinary was not just her capacity to learn languages quickly, but her deep understanding of the cultural contexts that gave meaning to linguistic expression. She recognized that effective translation required more than word-for-word conversion between languages. True communication demanded understanding of cultural values, social expectations, and the subtle implications that could change the meaning of identical words in different contexts. Her Korean language skills, for example, had developed through her fascination with Korean popular culture, but had deepened through her exploration of traditional Korean literature and philosophy. She understood the complex system of honorifics that reflected social relationships and hierarchies in Korean society. She knew when to use formal versus informal speech patterns, and she could navigate the subtle implications of different levels of politeness that could make the difference between respectful communication and inadvertent offense. Similarly, her German proficiency extended beyond basic conversational ability to include understanding of the language's capacity for creating compound words that expressed complex concepts with precision and efficiency. She appreciated how German syntax allowed for sentence structures that could convey multiple layers of meaning simultaneously, and she had developed sensitivity to regional variations in pronunciation and vocabulary that reflected Germany's complex cultural geography. Ivy's dedication to language learning required extraordinary discipline and time management skills that impressed even her father, who had learned to recognize the depth of her commitment. While other young people her age spent their free time on social media or video games, Ivy could typically be found with headphones on, listening to language instruction materials or international news broadcasts. She had developed the ability to absorb linguistic information while simultaneously completing other tasks, often practicing pronunciation under her breath, while doing homework or helping her father with household chores. Her bedroom in their small Belltown apartment had become a testament to her linguistic passion. The walls were covered with maps of countries where her target languages were spoken, alongside handwritten vocabulary lists and grammar charts that she created to reinforce her learning. She had collected dictionaries, phrase books, and cultural guides from library book sales and thrift stores, building an impressive reference collection. Despite the family's limited financial resources, Jonas had initially been puzzled by his Daughter's unusual hobby, particularly during the early stages when her interests seemed to emerge from nowhere. Neither he nor his late wife had demonstrated particular aptitude for foreign languages, and they had no family connections to other cultures that might explain Ivy's fascination with international communication. But he had learned to support her passion wholeheartedly, recognizing that her gifts represented possibilities that extended far beyond their current circumstances. The practical applications of Ivy's linguistic abilities had begun to manifest in small but meaningful ways. Throughout their daily lives, she had helped elderly neighbors who spoke limited English navigate complex medical forms and insurance documents. She had assisted international students at the local community college with their English homework, often discovering that she could communicate with them in their native languages. She had even helped resolve miscommunications at local businesses when language barriers created problems for immigrant customers. These experiences had taught Ivy that language skills carried responsibilities as well as opportunities. She had learned that people trusted her with sensitive information when they discovered she could communicate in their native languages, and she had developed a mature understanding of the importance of confidentiality and cultural sensitivity. She had witnessed firsthand how effective communication could resolve conflicts, build relationships, and create opportunities for mutual understanding across cultural divides. Her teachers at Roosevelt High School had begun to recognize her exceptional abilities and had made arrangements for her to participate in advanced language programs through the University of Washington. Several professors had expressed amazement at her intuitive grasp of linguistic concepts that typically challenged graduate students. But Ivy remained remarkably humble about her gifts, viewing them as tools for helping others rather than sources of personal distinction or advantage. The morning of the merger crisis, as she prepared to accompany her father to his emergency repair job at TechFlow Industries, Ivy packed her usual collection of study materials. Her backpack contained Korean language podcasts downloaded to her phone, a German grammar workbook she was using to refine her understanding of subjunctive mood constructions, and a notebook where she practiced writing an Arabic script. She had no way of knowing that within a few hours, these seemingly academic pursuits would become the key to preventing the corporate disaster worth billions of dollars. Her presence in the TechFlow Industries building that day was simply the result of a single father's need to balance work responsibilities with parental care. But the extraordinary linguistic gifts she brought with her, combined with her natural empathy and cultural sensitivity, would soon transform an impossible situation into an opportunity for human connection across the barriers of language, culture, and social class. Celine Caraway inhabited a world where power was measured, not just in dollars but in the ability to shape entire industries with the stroke of a pen. At 38 years old, she had built her reputation as one of the most formidable corporate executives on the West Coast, known for her strategic brilliance, her unwavering determination, and her capacity to close deals that others considered impossible. Her corner office on the 50th floor of the Meridian Tower served as both command center and sanctuary, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Puget Sound that reminded her daily of how far she had climbed from her humble origins. Daughter of a small-town Oregon lumber mill worker, Celine had understood from an early age that success would require not just intelligence and hard work, but the kind of relentless ambition that could sustain her through years of 18-hour days and cutthroat competition. She had earned her MBA from Stanford on a full scholarship, financing her education through a combination of student loans, work-study programs, and summer internships that paid just enough to cover basic living expenses. Every opportunity had been seized, every connection carefully cultivated, every setback transformed into motivation for greater achievement. Her rise through the corporate hierarchy at TechFlow Industries had been meteoric, but not without cost. She had sacrificed relationships, postponed personal happiness, and made countless compromises that had gradually changed her from an idealistic young woman who wanted to use business as a force for positive change into a pragmatic executive who understood that survival in corporate America required emotional detachment and strategic thinking that prioritized results over relationships. Her wardrobe reflected both her success and her understanding of how appearance influenced perception. In high-stakes business environments, the Armani suits, the Hermes handbags, the carefully selected jewelry that projected authority without ostentation, every detail had been chosen to communicate competence, sophistication, and the kind of unquestionable success that commanded respect from colleagues, competitors, and subordinates alike. She had learned that in corporate boardrooms, women faced scrutiny that men never experienced, and she had adapted by constructing an image of professional perfection that left no room for criticism or doubt. Her personal life had been shaped by the demands of her professional ambitions and scarred by betrayals that had left her deeply suspicious of other people's motives. 3 years earlier, she had discovered that her fiancé, Michael Harrison, had been systematically using their relationship to gain access to confidential business information that he then sold to competing firms. The betrayal had been devastating, not just because of the financial damage to TechFlow Industries, but because it had shattered her ability to trust her own judgment about the people closest to her. Michael had been charming, intelligent, and apparently successful in his own right. As a financial consultant, their relationship had seemed like a perfect partnership between equals, built on shared interests, mutual respect, and genuine affection. She had been planning their wedding, had begun to imagine a future that included both professional success and personal happiness, when she discovered the evidence of his systematic deception in emails he had carelessly left open on his laptop. The realization that every intimate conversation, every moment of vulnerability, every expression of love had been calculated to extract information that could be monetized had left Selene feeling hollow and used in ways that she struggled to articulate even to herself. The violation had been so complete, so fundamental, that it had poisoned her ability to believe in the possibility of authentic human connection. She had ended their relationship immediately and had retreated into a professional identity that provided clear rules, measurable objectives, and the kind of emotional safety that came from treating all human interactions as business transactions. Since then, Selene had constructed elaborate defenses against the possibility of being hurt again. She dated occasionally, but only men whose backgrounds had been thoroughly researched, whose motives seemed transparent, and whose capacity to damage her professionally or emotionally appeared limited. She maintained friendly but carefully bounded relationships with colleagues, sharing enough personal information to seem approachable while revealing nothing that could be used against her later. She had learned to read people's intentions through their actions rather than their words, to identify the subtle signs of manipulation and self-interest that most people revealed if observed carefully enough. That her success at TechFlow Industries had been built on this foundation of strategic thinking and emotional discipline. She had transformed the company from a mid-sized software development firm into a global technology leader through a series of acquisitions, partnerships, and product innovations that had consistently outperformed market expectations. Under her leadership, the company's value had increased by over 400%, making her one of the most respected executives in the technology sector and creating substantial wealth for shareholders, employees, and herself. The merger with Hantech Corporation represented the culmination of her professional achievements and the realization of a strategic vision she had been developing for over 5 years. The Korean company's revolutionary advances in quantum computing technology would position the merged entity at the forefront of the next generation of computational innovation. The deal would create the world's largest quantum computing research and development organization, with resources that could accelerate technological breakthroughs by decades rather than years. But the merger also represented something more personal. For Selene, success would validate her approach to business and life, proving that emotional detachment and strategic thinking could overcome any obstacle. It would demonstrate that the sacrifices she had made, the relationship she had forgone, and the walls she had built around her heart had been justified by the magnitude of her professional accomplishments. Her preparation for the negotiations had been exhaustive and meticulous. She had spent months studying Korean business culture, learning about the personal backgrounds and professional histories of each member of the Hantech delegation, and developing negotiation strategies that accounted for cultural differences in communication styles and decision-making processes. She had engaged the best simultaneous interpreter available, Dr. Margaret Chun, whose reputation for accuracy and cultural sensitivity had made her the preferred translator for high-level international business negotiations throughout the Pacific Rim. The morning of the merger discussions, Selene had arrived at the office before dawn to review final preparations and ensure that every detail had been perfected. The conference room had been arranged to accommodate Korean preferences for formal seating arrangements and respectful distance between negotiating parties. Traditional Korean tea had been provided alongside American coffee and the presentation. Materials had been formatted to reflect Korean expectations for document structure and visual design. Her confidence had been absolute as the negotiations began. Every contingency had been anticipated, every potential objection had been addressed, and every aspect of the complex merger agreement had been carefully structured to satisfy the interests of both organizations. The technical presentations had proceeded smoothly, with the Korean executives expressing genuine enthusiasm for the innovative approaches that TechFlow Industries had developed for quantum processing applications. But now, as Dr. Chen was wheeled out of the conference room on a stretcher, and the reality of their situation became clear, Selene felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in around her. This was exactly the kind of unpredictable human variable that could destroy even the most carefully planned business strategy. The Korean executives were already gathering their materials, preparing to leave, and months of preparation were dissolving into failure despite her best efforts to control every possible variable. The irony was bitter and inescapable. She had built her entire professional identity on the belief that success came from eliminating human unpredictability through careful planning and strategic thinking. But now, faced with a crisis that no amount of preparation could have prevented, she found herself powerless to save the most important deal of her career. The emotional walls that had protected her from personal betrayal now seemed to isolate her from the kind of human connections that might offer solutions to problems that couldn't be solved through corporate strategies alone. The morning of November 15th had begun like any other routine maintenance call for Jonas Merrick, but the urgency in his supervisor's voice when the phone rang at 7:30 a.m. suggested that this would be different from his typical repair assignments. The main conference room's sophisticated audiovisual system had suffered a complete failure during the night, leaving TechFlow Industries facing the prospect of conducting their most important business presentation in corporate history without the ability to display technical specifications, financial projections, or the carefully prepared materials that would demonstrate their quantum computing capabilities to potential Korean partners. Jonas had quickly assessed the situation over the phone with building management and determined that the problem likely involved both hardware malfunction and software configuration issues that would require several hours of diagnostic work and component replacement. Under normal circumstances, he would have scheduled the repair for the following evening during his regular shift, but the urgency of the situation and the substantial overtime compensation being offered made it impossible to decline the emergency call. The decision to bring Ivy with him had not been made lightly. His daughter was still recovering from the influenza that had kept her home from school for the past 3 days, and while her fever had broken and she was clearly on the mend, Jonas's protective instincts rebelled against leaving her alone while she was still weak and vulnerable. At 12 years old, Ivy was certainly mature enough to be left unsupervised for short periods, but the combination of her recent illness and the unpredictable duration of the repair work made Jonas uncomfortable with leaving her alone in there. Ivy had understood her father's dilemma without requiring detailed explanation, and had immediately volunteered to accompany him to the Tech Flow building. She promised to remain invisible during his work, bringing along her study materials and finding a quiet corner where she could continue her language practice without disturbing the important business activities that would be taking place. Her backpack contained the usual collection of linguistic resources, Korean language podcasts downloaded to her phone, a German grammar workbook, Arabic writing practice sheets, and the small notebook where she recorded new vocabulary and grammatical structures from her various language learning projects. The elevator ride to the 47th floor had been silent, with Jonas reviewing the technical specifications he had been given for the audiovisual system malfunction while Ivy studied her Korean flashcards, occasionally murmuring pronunciation exercises under her breath. Neither father nor daughter could have imagined that, within a few hours, those quietly practiced Korean phrases would become the key to preventing a corporate disaster worth billions of dollars. The Meridian Tower's executive floors represented a world that Jonas typically encountered only during the quiet hours, when the building's important occupants had departed for their homes in exclusive suburbs and luxury condominiums. During his normal night shift, he moved through these spaces like a custodial ghost, maintaining the sophisticated infrastructure that kept the corporate machinery functioning without ever interacting with the executives who made the decisions that shaped entire industries. The 47th floor conference room, where the merger negotiations would take place, was a temple to corporate power and technological sophistication. The mahogany table that dominated the center of the space had cost more than Jonas earned in an entire year, while the leather chairs surrounding it represented handcrafted luxury that most working people could never afford. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond, a constant reminder of the elevated perspective that wealth and success could provide. Jonas immediately began his diagnostic work on the malfunctioning audiovisual equipment, methodically testing connections, checking software configurations, and identifying the cascade of component failures that had rendered the system inoperable. The problem proved to be more complex than initially anticipated, involving both hardware issues with the main projection unit and software conflicts in the network interface that controlled the system's connectivity to TechFlow's internal databases. Ivy settled herself in a corner of the conference room with characteristic discretion, cross-legged on the thick carpet with her study materials arranged around her in a neat semicircle. She had perfected the art of making herself invisible in adult spaces, understanding instinctively that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed in professional environments where working-class families were generally viewed as intrusions rather than integral parts of the corporate ecosystem. Her morning study routine proceeded as usual, with Korean language podcasts flowing through her earbuds while she reviewed vocabulary cards and practiced writing Hangul characters in her notebook. The podcast she had chosen for that day featured business conversations and formal presentations, linguistic patterns that would prove remarkably relevant to the crisis that was developing just hours away. She had been particularly focused on mastering the complex honorific systems that governed polite communication in Korean business culture, understanding instinctively that effective cross-cultural communication required sensitivity to social hierarchies and cultural expectations. The first executives began arriving at the building shortly before 8 a.m., their purposeful strides and expensive attire marking them as members of the corporate elite who rarely noticed the maintenance workers and support staff whose labor made their success possible. Jonas was accustomed to this invisibility and had learned to appreciate the way it allowed him to work without interruption or scrutiny from people who might question his methods or expertise. But Celine Caraway was different. when she entered the conference room at 8:30 a.m. to conduct her final review of the space before the Korean delegation's arrival. Her sharp eyes immediately registered both Jonas's presence and the unexpected sight of a young girl sitting quietly in the corner, with study materials spread around her. Her reaction was immediate and uncompromising, reflecting both her perfectionist standards for professional environments and her deep-seated need to maintain complete control over every aspect of important business situations. "Excuse me, Selene," said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance with her directives. "This is highly inappropriate. Bringing family members to the workplace, especially during critical business negotiations, demonstrates a fundamental lack of professional judgment and respect for corporate boundaries." Her appearance commanded attention and respect even from those who disagreed with her positions. The tailored Armani blazer emphasized her tall, elegant figure, while her diamond-studded Cartier watch caught the morning light, streaming through the conference room's massive windows. Every detail of her presentation had been carefully calculated to project competence, success, and the kind of unquestionable authority that made challenging her decisions seem both futile and potentially dangerous to one's career prospects. Jonas looked up from the cable connections he had been testing, his face immediately flushing with the embarrassment and anxiety that working-class people often experienced when confronted by authority figures who questioned their decisions or challenged their right to exist in professional spaces. He had spent years perfecting the art of remaining invisible in corporate environments, and the sudden spotlight of executive attention felt like a violation of the unspoken rules that governed his professional survival. "I'm incredibly sorry, Ms. Carroway," Jonas replied, his voice tight with genuine remorse and barely controlled panic about the potential consequences of this confrontation for his continued employment. "My daughter has been recovering from the flu for the past few days, and I didn't have anyone who could watch her during the emergency repair call. I understand this isn't appropriate, and I promise you it won't happen again. If you need me to make alternative arrangements, I can call my supervisor and see if someone else can complete the work." Selene's initial inclination was to insist on the immediate enforcement of professional boundaries that she viewed as essential to maintaining the kind of controlled environment where billion-dollar negotiations could proceed without distraction or complication. Her experience had taught her that making exceptions to established rules, regardless of the personal circumstances that might justify such flexibility, inevitably led to erosion of standards and the kind of chaos that could derail carefully planned business operations. But before she could formulate her response, Ivy's phone rang with the soft musical tone she had programmed to indicate calls from Mrs. Park. The elderly Korean woman who lived in the apartment next to theirs in the Belltown building, Mrs. Park, was 82 years old and had been struggling with loneliness and depression since her husband's death 6 months earlier. She spoke limited English and often felt isolated in a culture whose language and customs remained largely mysterious to her despite her 40 years of residence in the United States. Without hesitation, Ivy answered the phone and immediately began speaking in fluent, respectful Korean, her voice warm with genuine affection and concern for the elderly woman who had become like a grandmother to her. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with the kind of patient attention and emotional generosity that had become increasingly rare in Seattle's fast-paced urban environment. Mrs. Park had called because she was confused about an important medical appointment scheduled for later that week and needed help understanding the instructions she had received from her cardiologist's office. Ivy listened carefully to her concerns, asked clarifying questions in grammatically perfect Korean, and then spent several minutes explaining the appointment procedures, medication instructions, and transportation arrangements that Mrs. Park would need to navigate successfully. For Selene, standing motionless in her expensive business attire and watching this unexpected scene unfold before her eyes, The experience was profoundly disorienting. The young girl spoke Korean with a fluency and sophistication that seemed impossible for someone her age. But more importantly, she demonstrated a level of compassion, patience, and cultural sensitivity that contrasted sharply with the self-interested behavior that Selene had learned to expect from most people in her professional and personal life. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Ivy providing not just translation services, but genuine emotional support for an elderly woman who clearly valued their relationship as one of the few bright spots in her increasingly difficult daily routine. There was no performance in Ivy's manner, no awareness that she was being observed by potentially important people, no calculation about how her behavior might be received or rewarded by adult authority figures. This was pure compassion in action. The kind of selfless generosity that Selene had almost forgotten existed in a world that had taught her to question everyone's motives and to view human interactions through the lens of strategic advantage and potential exploitation. The young girl was helping someone who needed assistance simply because it was the right thing to do, without expecting recognition, compensation, or any form of personal benefit from her kindness. When the call ended and Ivy returned to her Korean language studies as if nothing unusual had happened, Selene found herself reassessing both the situation and her own initial reaction to finding a working-class family in her carefully controlled corporate environment. The demonstration of linguistic ability had been impressive, but the glimpse of authentic human goodness had been transformative, in ways that she was only beginning to understand. 3 hours later, the conference room had been transformed into the epicenter of one of the most significant business negotiations in Pacific Northwest history. The Hantech Corporation delegation had arrived precisely on schedule, their black luxury sedans pulling up to the Meridian Tower's main entrance at exactly 10 a.m. Mr. Park Seung-ho, the distinguished CEO whose silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses projected both wisdom and authority, led his team of 4 senior executives into the building with the measured dignity that characterized high-level Korean business culture. The preliminary discussions had proceeded with encouraging smoothness. Technical specifications for TechFlow Industries' quantum processing capabilities had been reviewed in exhaustive detail, with the Korean executives expressing genuine enthusiasm for the innovative approaches that American engineers had developed. For quantum entanglement applications, financial projections had been carefully analyzed, patent portfolios had been thoroughly examined, and the complex regulatory requirements that would govern the merged entity's operations in both countries had been systematically addressed. Dr. Margaret Chun had been performing her simultaneous interpretation duties with the professional excellence that had made her the preferred translator for high-stakes international negotiations throughout the Asia-Pacific region. Her ability to convey not just the literal meaning of technical discussions, but also the subtle cultural implications that could influence business relationships had been essential to building the trust and understanding necessary for successful cross-cultural partnerships. But as the morning progressed toward the critical final phase of negotiations, the accumulated stress of 3 days of intensive discussions began to take its toll on Dr. Chun's health. She had been working 12-hour days, sleeping poorly in an unfamiliar hotel room, and maintaining the intense concentration required for accurate simultaneous translation of highly technical material. The Korean language's complex honorific systems, combined with the specialized vocabulary of quantum computing technology and international corporate law, demanded a level of mental precision that few interpreters could sustain for extended periods. Dr. Jonas had completed his repair work on the audiovisual system shortly before the negotiations began, but building management had requested that he remain available in case additional technical support became necessary during the presentations. He had positioned himself discreetly near the conference room's service entrance, monitoring the sophisticated equipment remotely through his diagnostic tablet while Ivy continued her language studies in the corner where Selene had first encountered them. The crisis struck without warning at 12:47 p.m., precisely as the negotiations were entering their most delicate phase. The Korean executives had raised complex questions about intellectual property protection for Hantek's proprietary quantum algorithms, issues that required careful translation of legal concepts that carried different implications under American versus Korean patent law. Dr. Chun had been explaining the subtleties of these distinctions when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence, clutched her chest, and collapsed onto the Persian carpet that covered the conference room floor. The immediate response was swift and professional. Selene's assistant Jennifer called 911 within seconds, while building security personnel trained in emergency medical response arrived to provide basic life support until paramedics could reach the 47th floor. Dr. Chun remained conscious, but was clearly in severe distress. Her face pale and her breathing labored as the medical team carefully assessed her condition and prepared her for immediate transport to Harborview Medical Center. The preliminary diagnosis was cardiac stress, likely triggered by the combination of physical exhaustion, irregular eating patterns, and the psychological pressure of facilitating negotiations worth billions of dollars. The paramedics' professional assessment suggested that Dr. Chun would require several days of hospitalization and weeks of recovery before she could return to the demanding work of simultaneous interpretation for high-stakes business negotiations. As the elevator doors closed behind the medical team, carrying Dr. Chun toward the emergency treatment that might save her life, the conference room fell into a profound and increasingly desperate silence. The Korean executives gathered around Mr. Park, speaking in rapid Korean that conveyed their obvious concern about the situation and their uncertainty about how to proceed. Without a qualified interpreter, the intricate final negotiations that required precise understanding of technical terminology, legal implications, and cultural nuances had become impossible to continue. Selene felt her carefully constructed professional world beginning to disintegrate around her. The merger agreement contained dozens of complex clauses that required exact translation, not just of individual words, but of entire legal concepts that carried different weight and implications in American versus Korean corporate law. The liability structures, the intellectual property transfers, the employment protection agreements for workers in both countries, the environmental compliance requirements, the regulatory approval processes, all of these required the kind of nuanced understanding that only a highly trained professional interpreter could provide. Mr. Park leaned forward in his leather chair, his expression grave as he addressed his colleagues in formal Korean. Although none of the American negotiators could understand his words, the tone and body language clearly conveyed the urgency of their situation and the impossibility of proceeding without proper translation services. The Hantek delegation had traveled halfway around the world for this moment, bringing with them the full authority of their board of directors to commit substantial resources to the partnership. But they could not sign agreements they did not fully understand, regardless of their enthusiasm for the business opportunity. Jennifer had been frantically working her phone since the moment Dr. Chen collapsed, reaching out to every professional translation service in Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver. The responses were uniformly disappointing. The few interpreters with the necessary qualifications for simultaneous translation of technical business discussions were either already committed to other assignments, located too far away to arrive before the Korean executive's scheduled departure, or lacked the specialized knowledge of quantum computing terminology and international corporate law that this negotiation required. The clock on the conference room wall seemed to tick with increasing volume as precious minutes slipped away. In Seoul, it was already Wednesday morning, and the Hantek board of directors was waiting for confirmation that the merger agreement had been successfully completed. Asian stock markets would open soon, and any delay would require public disclosure. That could send both companies' share prices plummeting. The ripple effects would extend far beyond the two corporations, affecting suppliers, partners, customers, and the thousands of families whose financial security depended on the stability and growth of these major technology employers. Selene stood slowly, her mind racing through increasingly desperate alternatives. Could they postpone the signing ceremony until a replacement interpreter could be found? The Korean executives had visa limitations and tight schedules that made extended stays in the United States problematic. Could they proceed with simplified versions of the most critical contract clauses? The interconnected nature of the merger documents meant that incomplete execution could create legal vulnerabilities that would haunt both companies for years to come. Could they attempt to continue with basic English communication supplemented by translation software? The technical complexity of quantum computing concepts and the cultural sensitivity required for Korean business relationships made such approaches completely inadequate. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Selene's shoulders like a physical burden that threatened to crush her spirit. As CEO of TechFlow Industries, she bore ultimate accountability for the success or failure of this deal. The board of directors who had entrusted her with the company's future, the shareholders who had invested their financial security in her leadership, the employees whose jobs depended on the company's continued growth and competitiveness, the customers who relied on technological innovations that the merger would enable. All of them were counting on her to find a solution to an impossible problem. The Korean executives began gathering their documents with the slow, deliberate movements that suggested preparation for departure. Mr. Park spoke quietly to his team, and while his words remained incomprehensible to the American negotiators, his tone conveyed profound regret and disappointment rather than anger or frustration. They understood that the medical emergency was beyond anyone's control, but understanding did not change the reality that they could not proceed without proper translation services that met their professional and legal obligations. In that moment of crisis, as 18 months of preparation and $2 billion in value seemed about to evaporate into nothing, nobody in the conference room could have anticipated that salvation would come from the most unlikely source imaginable. Sitting quietly in her corner beside her father, surrounded by Korean language study materials and completely absorbed in a grammar workbook that explained the subtle differences between formal and informal speech patterns, was a 12-year-old girl whose extraordinary gifts were about to transform an impossible situation into an opportunity for genuine human connection across the barriers of language, culture, and social class. Ivy had been following the morning's discussions with growing fascination, not because she understood the complex business implications of quantum computing mergers, but because she had been unconsciously absorbing the sophisticated Korean language patterns that Dr. Chun had been using for simultaneous interpretation. The formal business vocabulary, the complex honorific systems, the cultural protocols that governed respectful communication in high-stakes Korean professional environments. All of these linguistic elements had been registering in her remarkable mind as she continued her own study of Korean grammar and pronunciation. When Dr. Chun collapsed and the gravity of the situation became clear, Ivy felt a familiar stirring of the compassion that had always motivated her to help others overcome communication barriers. She had witnessed the distress in Mr. Park's voice as he spoke to his colleagues, had observed the frustration and sadness in the Korean executive's body language, and had recognized the desperation in Selene's increasingly frantic attempts to find alternative solutions to their translation crisis. Standing slowly from her position on the carpet, closing her Korean grammar workbook and setting aside her study materials, Ivy approached the massive conference table where billions of dollars in corporate value hung in the balance. Her movement was quiet but purposeful, guided by the same instinctive desire to help others that had motivated her phone call with Mrs. Park that morning, and countless other acts of linguistic generosity throughout her young life. "Excuse me," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent conference room with surprising authority and confidence. "I can help with the translation if you'd like." The reaction was immediate and electric. Every person in the room turned to stare at this unexpected interruption from someone they had barely noticed during the morning's proceedings. Selini's eyes widened with a mixture of surprise, hope, and profound skepticism about whether a 12-year-old girl could possibly understand the complexity of the situation they faced. Jonas felt his heart leap with pride at his daughter's courage, while simultaneously experiencing parental anxiety about the enormous pressure she was volunteering to accept. But it was Mr. Park's reaction that proved most significant. Rising from his chair with the formal dignity that characterized his approach to business relationships, he addressed Ivy directly in Korean, speaking slowly and clearly as he asked whether she truly understood the nature of the documents they were discussing and the importance of accurate translation for such complex business negotiations. Ivy responded immediately in flawless Korean, using the appropriate honorifics and formal speech patterns as she explained that, while she was young and certainly not a professional interpreter, she had been studying Korean language and culture intensively for several years and believed she could provide adequate translation services to help both parties understand each other clearly and respectfully. The silence that followed this exchange was profound and transformative. Everyone in the room had just witnessed something that seemed impossible: a 12-year-old American girl conducting a sophisticated business conversation in perfect Korean with one of the most important technology executives in Asia. What followed over the next 3 hours was nothing short of miraculous. Ivy stepped into Dr. Chen's role with a composure and competence that defied every assumption the adults in the room held about age, capability, and professional expertise. She positioned herself between the American and Korean negotiating teams, maintaining the respectful physical distance that Korean business culture required while ensuring clear sightlines for effective communication with all participants. Translation work went far beyond simple word-for-word conversion between languages. She demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the cultural contexts that gave meaning to business discussions, recognizing when certain phrases carried different emotional weight or legal implications in Korean versus American corporate environments. When complex technical concepts needed explanation, she found ways to convey not just the literal meaning but also the underlying significance that each culture attached to innovations in quantum computing technology. The breakthrough moment came when the negotiations reached a particularly delicate point regarding intellectual property protection for Hantek's proprietary algorithms. The Korean executives had concerns about maintaining control over technologies they had developed through decades of research and substantial investment, while the American team needed adequate access to those innovations to make the merger financially viable for TechFlow shareholders. Ivy recognized that the impasse was not really about legal language or contract clauses, but about fundamental cultural differences in how the two societies approached concepts of ownership, sharing, and collaborative innovation. She spent nearly 20 minutes explaining to both sides how their respective concerns could be addressed through creative structuring that honored Korean preferences for maintaining technological sovereignty while providing American partners with the access they needed for successful product development. Her explanations were patient, thorough, and remarkably sophisticated for someone her age. She drew analogies to traditional Korean and American approaches to intellectual collaboration, referenced historical examples of successful cross-cultural technology partnerships, and suggested specific contract language that would satisfy both parties' underlying interests rather than just their stated positions. The solution she proposed was so elegant and culturally sensitive that both negotiating teams immediately recognized its value. As the afternoon progressed, Ivy's remarkable abilities became increasingly evident to everyone in the room. She handled complex discussions of regulatory compliance, environmental protection standards, employment law differences, and financial reporting requirements with the same competence that had characterized her initial interventions. She never appeared flustered or uncertain, even when asked to translate highly technical quantum physics concepts or intricate legal terminology that challenged even Dr. Chen's professional expertise. But perhaps most impressively, Ivy maintained perfect cultural sensitivity throughout the negotiations. She understood when to use formal versus informal Korean speech patterns, how to convey respect for hierarchical relationships that governed Korean business culture, and when to allow for the periods of contemplative silence that Korean executives required for careful consideration of complex proposals. She never rushed the process or imposed American expectations for rapid decision-making on participants who needed time to reflect on the implications of various agreements. By 4:30 p.m., the merger agreement had been successfully completed, signed, and sealed with the traditional ceremonial formalities that both cultures required for such significant business partnerships. The $2 billion deal was secured, ensuring TechFlow Industries' expansion into Asian markets and creating the foundation for technological innovations that would benefit millions of customers worldwide. The successful conclusion protected thousands of jobs on both sides of the Pacific and established a model for future cross-cultural business collaboration in the rapidly evolving technology sector. Mr. Park, visibly moved by the extraordinary experience of working with such a remarkable young interpreter, addressed Ivy in Korean with formal expressions of gratitude and respect, typically reserved for senior business professionals. He told her that her cultural sensitivity and linguistic skills had not only saved a crucial business deal but had also created genuine understanding and appreciation between Korean and American business cultures that would benefit both organizations. For years to come, the other Korean executives joined their CEO in expressing formal thanks, bowing respectfully as they presented Ivy with a traditional Korean gift, a beautiful silk scarf embroidered with symbols representing wisdom, courage, and cross-cultural friendship. The gesture was both deeply meaningful and highly unusual, as Korean business culture rarely recognized contributions from individuals outside established professional hierarchies. Selene stood watching this ceremony with emotions she struggled to identify or process: pride, amazement, gratitude, and something deeper, a recognition that she had witnessed something far more significant than successful business negotiation. She had seen authentic human goodness in action, watched a young person use extraordinary gifts, not for personal advantage but for the simple purpose of helping others understand each other across cultural and linguistic barriers. As the Korean executives prepared for their departure to SeaTac Airport, the conference room buzzed with animated conversation about the day's unprecedented events. Several TechFlow employees who had observed portions of the negotiations began taking photos and videos with their smartphones, documenting what they recognized as a historic moment in the company's corporate history. Jennifer, Selene's assistant, had been so impressed by Ivy's performance that she recorded a brief video segment showing the young girl confidently translating complex business concepts between Korean and English. Her excitement was genuine and innocent. She wanted to preserve a record of this remarkable achievement that had saved her company from potential disaster. Without considering the implications, she posted the video to her personal social media accounts with the caption, "12-year-old genius saves $2 billion corporate merger. This amazing girl speaks 12 languages and just prevented the biggest business disaster in Seattle history." The response was immediate and explosive. Within 2 hours, the video had been shared thousands of times across multiple social media platforms. By evening, it had accumulated over 100,000 views and hundreds of comments ranging from amazement and admiration to skepticism and inappropriate speculation about Ivy's abilities and family circumstances. The story was picked up by local news outlets, then by national media organizations that recognized the viral potential of a feel-good story about a remarkable Young person saving a major corporation through extraordinary linguistic abilities. Television. Producers began calling TechFlow Industries' main number, requesting interviews with the miracle girl who speaks 12 languages. Talk show bookers offered substantial appearance fees for exclusive access to Ivy and her family. Publishing agents inquired about book deals, while documentary filmmakers proposed projects about exceptional young people who demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. The comments on social media platforms revealed both the best and worst aspects of public attention. Many viewers expressed genuine admiration for Ivy's remarkable abilities and praised her compassionate use of her gifts to help others. Parents shared stories of their own linguistically gifted youngsters, while educators discussed the importance of supporting exceptional students who demonstrated unusual talents at early ages. But other responses were more troubling. Some commenters questioned whether the entire scenario had been staged for publicity purposes, suggesting that no 12-year-old could possibly understand complex business negotiations or handle the pressure of billion-dollar corporate deals. Others made inappropriate observations about Ivy's personal life, speculating about her family's economic circumstances and questioning her father's motives for allowing her to participate in such high-stakes professional environments. The most disturbing comments came from individuals who seemed to view Ivy as a curiosity or entertainment rather than a human being deserving privacy and protection. They demanded more information about her abilities, wanted to test her linguistic skills through public challenges, and suggested that she should be available for public appearances and educational demonstrations that would allow others to witness her remarkable capabilities firsthand. Jonas discovered the viral video at 11:30 p.m. as he was preparing to leave for his regular night shift at TechFlow Industries. A concerned neighbor had called to tell him that videos of his daughter were circulating on the internet, attracting attention that might not be entirely positive or appropriate. When he found the original post and began reading the comments, his reaction was immediate and visceral. The pride he felt in his daughter's remarkable achievement was overwhelmed by parental fury at seeing her privacy violated and her innocence exploited for public entertainment. The video had been posted without his knowledge or consent, transforming what should have been a private moment of personal triumph into a public spectacle that exposed his family to scrutiny they had never sought or desired. The comments that speculated inappropriately about Ivy's abilities, questioned his parenting decisions, and treated his daughter like a performing animal rather than a human being made Jonas feel physically sick with rage and protective desperation. His quiet family life had been suddenly thrust into an unwanted spotlight that threatened to destroy the careful balance he had worked so hard to maintain between supporting his daughter's gifts and protecting her from a world that might not understand or appreciate her unique nature. The violation felt personal and profound. His daughter's remarkable act of compassion and cross-cultural service had been transformed into content for social media consumption, reducing her extraordinary linguistic abilities and cultural sensitivity to entertainment value for strangers who had no understanding of the years of dedication and study that had made her intervention possible. As Jonas sat in their small Belltown apartment, reading comment after comment that treated his beloved daughter like a circus attraction rather than a remarkable young person who had used her gifts to help others, he felt the same protective fury that had sustained him through the difficult years following his wife's death. But this time, the threat to his family's well-being was not illness or economic hardship. It was the unwanted attention of a world that seemed determined to exploit rather than protect the extraordinary goodness he had witnessed in his daughter. Throughout her young life, Jonas Merrick had experienced many difficult moments during his years as a single father, but nothing had prepared him for the fury that consumed him as he sat in their modest apartment, reading hundreds of comments that reduced his daughter to a curiosity for public consumption. The invasion of their privacy felt like a physical assault, made worse by the realization that Ivy's remarkable act of compassion and cross-cultural service had been transformed into entertainment content for strangers who had no understanding of the years of dedication and sacrifice that had made her extraordinary abilities possible. Sleep became impossible as Jonas spent the entire night monitoring the viral spread of his daughter's story across social media platforms, news websites, and discussion forums that seemed to multiply by the hour. Each new share brought fresh waves of commentary that ranged from genuine admiration to inappropriate speculation about their family's personal circumstances. Some commenters questioned whether the entire scenario had been fabricated for publicity purposes, while others demanded proof of Ivy's linguistic abilities through public demonstrations that would satisfy their skepticism about her remarkable capabilities. The most disturbing responses came from individuals who seemed to view Ivy as a resource to be exploited rather than a human being deserving protection and privacy. Educational consultants proposed lucrative speaking engagements at conferences about gifted youngsters. Entertainment industry representatives inquired about television appearances and documentary projects that would showcase her abilities for national audiences. Publishing agents offered substantial advances for books about extraordinary linguistic development in exceptional young people. By dawn, Jonas had made a decision that crystallized all of his protective instincts into a single unwavering determination to shield his daughter from further exploitation. He called his supervisor to request emergency leave from his regular night shift duties, explaining that a family crisis required his immediate attention during normal business hours. Then he spent the morning preparing for what he knew would be one of the most important conversations of his life. At precisely 9 a.m., Jonas called TechFlow Industries' executive offices and requested an immediate meeting with CEO Selene Caraway. The receptionist initially attempted to schedule an appointment for the following week, explaining that Ms. Caraway's calendar was completely booked with post-merger activities and media interviews about the successful completion of the Hontech Corporation partnership. But Jonas's quiet insistence and the unusual nature of his request, a maintenance worker demanding immediate access to the company's chief executive, eventually secured him a brief appointment at 10:30 a.m. The elevator ride to the 50th floor felt interminable as Jonas rehearsed the arguments he would make and tried to control the emotions that threatened to overwhelm his carefully planned approach. He had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility in corporate environments, understanding that working-class employees were expected to remain grateful for employment opportunities without challenging the decisions made by their social and economic superiors. But this situation transcended normal hierarchical considerations. This was about protecting his daughter from exploitation by people who saw her only as a means to their own ends. Selene's corner office represented a world of privilege and power that Jonas had only glimpsed during his years of maintaining the building's infrastructure after the important people had departed for their suburban homes. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered commanding views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains, while original artwork and antique furniture created an environment that emphasized the vast economic distance between his working-class existence and her executive lifestyle. But Jonas's focus remained entirely concentrated on the purpose of his visit. He had come to demand protection for his daughter, and no amount of corporate intimidation or executive authority would deter him from that mission. When Selene's assistant Jennifer ushered him into the office, he carried himself with the dignity of a man whose principles mattered more than his employment status or economic vulnerability. Selene was dressed in an elegant Chanel suit that emphasized her professional authority, but Jonas noticed something different in her demeanor from their brief encounter the previous morning. The harsh judgment and corporate rigidity that had characterized her initial reaction to finding Ivy in the conference room had been replaced by something that looked almost like guilt or regret. "Mr. Merrick," she began, but Jonas interrupted her before she could complete whatever corporate pleasantries she had planned to offer. "This has to stop immediately. he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion and parental desperation. My daughter is not a circus act or a marketing tool for your company's benefit. She's a 12-year-old girl who tried to help people communicate effectively, and now she's being treated like some kind of freak show attraction for internet entertainment. The words poured out of him with years of accumulated frustration about the way wealthy institutions treated working class families as expendable resources rather than human beings with dignity and rights. Do you have any idea what it's like to read hundreds of comments from strangers who want to test my daughter's abilities, who think she should be available for public demonstrations, who treat her like she exists for their amusement rather than as a human being who deserves privacy and protection? Jonas's voice grew stronger as he continued, fueled by righteous anger and paternal love. She helped save your billion-dollar deal because she has a good heart and wanted to help people understand each other. That was an act of compassion, not a performance for social media. And now your employee has turned her into a viral sensation, without our permission or consent, exposing her to attention from people who don't care about her well-being or her right to a normal childhood. Selene felt each word like a physical blow, recognizing the absolute justice of Jonas's anger and the profound failure of responsibility that his accusations revealed. As CEO of TechFlow Industries, she should have immediately recognized the potential for exploitation when Ivy volunteered to help with the translation crisis. She should have established clear guidelines about privacy and confidentiality that would have protected a minor who became involved in corporate business through unusual circumstances. Her failure to anticipate this possibility and take preventive action felt like a betrayal of the trust that had been placed in her, however unintentionally, when Ivy stepped forward to help resolve their communication crisis. The weight of her negligence pressed down on her shoulders like a crushing burden that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. You're absolutely right, Selene replied, her voice barely above a whisper as emotions she had suppressed for years threatened to break through her professional facade. I take complete responsibility for what happened to your family. I should have protected Ivy immediately, should have seen this possibility and taken steps to prevent it. But Jonas was not finished expressing his fury about the situation. Do you understand what this means for our lives? We live quietly, we don't seek attention or publicity. And we certainly don't want strangers on the internet speculating about our personal circumstances or treating my daughter like she's some kind of performing monkey. Her privacy has been violated, her innocence exploited, and our family has been thrust into a spotlight we never wanted and certainly never consented to. The conversation was painful for both participants, but for very different reasons. Jonas was experiencing the protective rage that had sustained him through every challenge of single parenthood, amplified by the recognition that his daughter's remarkable goodness had been transformed into public entertainment. Selene was confronting the reality that her corporate success had been built on a foundation of emotional detachment that left her unprepared to recognize and protect the human cost of business decisions. I've already contacted our legal team about having the video removed from all platforms where it appeared, Selene said, her voice thick with genuine remorse. We're working with social media companies to eliminate further distribution, and we've implemented new policies about employee confidentiality and the protection of individuals who become involved in company business through unusual circumstances. But Jonas's anger was not easily satisfied by corporate damage control measures. That's not enough, he said firmly. The damage is already done. The video has been shared thousands of times, copied to platforms you can't control, and seen by people who now think they have some kind of right to access my daughter or her abilities. You can't unsee what's been seen or unknow what's been learned about our family. Selene understood that legal remedies and policy changes, while necessary, could not repair the fundamental violation that had occurred. The privacy that Jonas had carefully maintained around his family's life, had been shattered in ways that might never be fully restored. The simple dignity of their quiet existence had been compromised by unwanted attention that would likely follow them for months or years to come. "What do you want from me?" Selene asked, recognizing that Jonas held every moral advantage in this confrontation and that her corporate authority was meaningless in the face of his justified parental outrage. "I want you to leave us alone," Jonas replied with quiet finality. "Completely alone. No more contact, no attempts to involve Ivy in company activities, no publicity opportunities, no educational programs, no volunteering initiatives, nothing. My daughter tried to help people yesterday because that's who she is, but I won't let her goodness be exploited again by people who see her as an opportunity rather than a human being who deserves protection." The ultimatum was delivered with the absolute authority that comes from moral certainty and parental love. Jonas had spent his adult life protecting his daughter from a world that might not understand or appreciate her unique gifts, and he would not allow corporate negligence to destroy the safe environment he had worked so hard to create. As he prepared to leave Selene's office, closing the door behind him with barely controlled fury, Jonas felt the satisfaction that comes from speaking truth to power and defending the people we love most against exploitation by those who see them only as means to their own ends. But he also felt the deeper sadness that comes from recognizing how quickly goodness can be transformed into something ugly when filtered through institutions that prioritize profit over human dignity. Selene was left alone with the crushing weight of her failure and the painful recognition that she had damaged something precious and irreplaceable through her negligence and lack of protective instinct. The silence in her office felt oppressive, filled with regret and missed opportunities for connection and understanding that might never be recovered. 4 days after their confrontational meeting, Selene Caraway found herself leaving the Meridian Tower later than usual following a series of post-merger integration meetings that had stretched well into the evening hours. The successful completion of the Hontech Corporation partnership had generated enormous excitement throughout the technology sector, bringing new opportunities and challenges that required her constant attention and strategic oversight. But despite the professional triumph that should have validated years of careful planning and negotiation, Selene felt emotionally hollow in ways that she struggled to understand or articulate. The elevator descended through the building's 47 floors in silence, carrying her toward the marble lobby where her driver would be waiting with the black Mercedes sedan that transported her between the corporate environments where she spent her days and the luxury penthouse apartment where she spent her increasingly lonely evenings. The routine had become so automatic that she rarely paid attention to the building's other occupants or the activities that continued long after most executives had departed for their suburban homes. But as the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, Selene encountered an unexpected scene that stopped her in her tracks and fundamentally altered her understanding of the world around her. Near the building's main entrance, sitting on one of the marble benches that provided seating for visitors waiting for appointments or meetings, was Ivy Merrick with an elderly man who appeared to be in considerable distress. The man was clearly homeless, his weathered clothing and unkempt appearance marking him as one of Seattle's invisible population of people who struggled daily with poverty, mental illness, and social isolation. His hands shook with what might have been withdrawal symptoms or neurological damage, and his eyes carried the defeated expression of someone who had learned not to expect kindness or assistance from the prosperous people who inhabited spaces like the Meridian Tower's elegant lobby. Ivy was sitting beside him with patient attention, speaking quietly in what sounded like fluent Russian as she helped him complete some kind of official paperwork that had clearly been causing him significant confusion and anxiety. Her voice carried the same gentle warmth that Selene had observed during her phone conversation with the elderly Korean neighbor. But now she was witnessing this compassion directed towards someone who society typically treated as invisible or problematic. Selene moved closer, positioning herself behind one of the lobby's marble columns where she could observe without disturbing the interaction. Ivy was explaining each section of what appeared to be a social services application form, carefully reading the questions aloud in Russian, and helping the man formulate appropriate responses that would present his situation clearly and honestly to bureaucrats who would make decisions about his access to housing assistance, medical care, and other essential services. The conversation revealed that the man's name was Victor, that he had immigrated to the United States 20 years earlier with dreams of building a better life for his family, and that a series of personal tragedies and economic setbacks had gradually eroded his stability until he found himself living on the streets and struggling to navigate systems designed to help people like him, but often too complex and intimidating for those without education or resources to understand effectively. What struck Selene most powerfully was not just Ivy's linguistic ability to communicate in fluent Russian, but her deep empathy for Victor's circumstances and her genuine respect for his dignity as a human being. She never spoke down to him or treated him as a charity case deserving pity rather than assistance. Instead, she listened carefully to his concerns, asked clarifying questions about his medical needs and housing preferences, and helped him present his situation in ways that would maximize his chances of receiving the support he desperately needed. The interaction continued for nearly 30 minutes, with Ivy patiently working through complex bureaucratic language and helping Victor understand his rights and options within Seattle's social service system. She made sure he had contact information for relevant agencies, explained the timeline for application processing, and even helped him organize his documentation in ways that would make future interactions with social workers more efficient and productive. But perhaps most remarkably, Ivy treated Victor with the same cultural sensitivity and respect that she had demonstrated during the corporate negotiations 4 days earlier. She understood that his pride and dignity were just as important as his practical needs, and she found ways to offer assistance that honored his autonomy and decision-making authority, rather than treating him as a passive recipient of charity. From more fortunate people, when their conversation concluded, Victor thanked Ivy with tears in his eyes, speaking in Russian that Selene couldn't understand, but whose emotional content was unmistakably clear. This young girl had treated him like a human being whose circumstances mattered, whose struggles deserved attention, and whose dignity remained intact despite the poverty and homelessness that had stripped away most of society's markers of respectability and worth. As Victor gathered his paperwork and slowly made his way toward the building's exit, Ivy sat quietly on the marble bench for several moments, making notes in her small notebook about resources and contact information that might help other people facing similar challenges. There was no performance in her demeanor, no awareness that she was being observed by someone who might reward or recognize her compassionate behavior, no calculation about how her actions might be received or valued by authority figures. Was pure human goodness in action, the kind of selfless generosity that Selene had almost forgotten existed in a world that had taught her to question everyone's motives and view human interactions through the lens of strategic advantage and potential exploitation. The young girl was helping someone who needed assistance simply because it was the right thing to do, without expecting recognition, compensation, or any form of personal benefit from her kindness. Standing there in her expensive Prada dress and Italian leather shoes, surrounded by the marble and gold fixtures that represented wealth and privilege, Selene felt a profound emptiness wash over her like a physical wave. She realized with startling clarity that Ivy's remarkable linguistic gifts and cultural sensitivity weren't tools for personal advancement or social climbing, but natural expressions of a compassionate spirit that sought genuine connection with people across the barriers of language, culture, and social class. The tears that began flowing down Selene's carefully applied makeup came from somewhere deep within her carefully guarded heart, from places that had been sealed off for years, to protect her from the possibility of being hurt or disappointed by people who might claim to care about her welfare and happiness. For the first time since her devastating betrayal by Michael Harrison, she found herself believing in the possibility of authentic human goodness that asked for nothing in return and gave generously simply because giving was the natural response to encountering others who needed help or understanding. The realization was overwhelming and transformative. She had been looking at Jonas and Ivy through the distorted lens of corporate strategy and personal advancement, projecting her own experiences of betrayal and manipulation onto a family that operated from entirely different values and principles. The father who worked night shifts to provide for his daughter, the girl who used extraordinary abilities to help others communicate and connect across cultural divides. These were people whose goodness was so authentic that it challenged every assumption about human nature that Selini's professional life had taught her to accept as inevitable realities. As she watched Ivy gather her belongings and prepare to leave the building, presumably to meet her father after his evening shift, Selini felt the carefully constructed walls around her heart beginning to crack and crumble. The emotional barriers that had protected her from vulnerability for years suddenly seemed less like necessary defenses and more like prison walls that had isolated her from the kind of authentic human connection that could heal the wounds left by years of professional success achieved at the cost of personal relationships. The following morning, Selini made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. Instead of handling the situation through formal corporate channels or delegating the responsibility to subordinates who could manage the practical details while maintaining her executive distance, she chose to approach Jonas and Ivy in the most humble and personal way possible. She went to her walk-in closet, past racks of designer business attire and shelves filled with expensive accessories that had become the armor she wore to project authority and success in professional environments. For the first time in years, she selected the simplest clothes she owned, a plain white cotton shirt and a pair of basic blue jeans that she had purchased years earlier but rarely worn because they seemed inappropriate for someone in her position. Significantly, she deliberately left all her jewelry at home, removing the diamond earrings, platinum bracelets, and other precious accessories that had become unconscious symbols of her wealth and social status. She kept only her father's vintage Rolex, a simple timepiece that connected her to family memories and personal history rather than corporate achievement and material success. The transformation felt both liberating and terrifying. Without her usual symbols of executive authority, she felt vulnerable and exposed in ways that she hadn't experienced since her early days in corporate America, when she was still learning to navigate the complex social dynamics that governed professional success. But she also felt more authentic than she had been in years, stripped of the artificial barriers that separated her from genuine human connection. The basement maintenance area of the Meridian Tower existed in a different universe from the executive floors where Celine typically conducted her business. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across concrete walls lined with industrial equipment, cleaning supplies, and the complex infrastructure that kept the building's sophisticated systems functioning 24 hours a day. The air carried the scent of machine oil and industrial cleaning products, a stark contrast to the expensive perfumes and fresh flower arrangements that characterized the executive suites. 50 floors above, Selene had never ventured into this part of the building during her 5 years as CEO of TechFlow Industries. Her interactions with maintenance staff had been limited to brief encounters in elevators or hallways, professional exchanges that maintained appropriate boundaries between executive authority and working-class service. But now, carrying a simple lunch bag containing sandwiches from a nearby delicatessen and a bottle of fresh fruit juice for Ivy, she felt like an explorer entering uncharted territory that would test everything she thought she understood about Human relationships and social hierarchies. She found Jonas during his lunch break in the small employee break room, a utilitarian space furnished with vending machines, a microwave oven, and a collection of mismatched chairs that had been discarded from various office renovations over the years. The contrast with the executive dining room where she typically took her meals, with its crystal chandeliers and catered cuisine prepared by professional chefs, could not have been more pronounced. But for the first time in years, Selene felt that she was in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Jonas looked up from the simple sandwich he had been eating while reading a technical manual about building automation systems, his expression immediately shifting from relaxed concentration to wary defensiveness as he recognized the woman who had failed to protect his daughter from exploitation just days earlier. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders straightened, his jaw tightened, and his eyes carried the guarded wariness of someone who had learned not to trust the motives of wealthy people, who suddenly showed interest in his family's welfare. "I think we need to talk," Selene said simply, settling herself across from Jonas on one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs without any attempt to maintain her usual air of executive authority or social superiority. Her entire appearance had been transformed from the intimidating CEO in designer clothing to a woman who looked vulnerable, genuine, and surprisingly approachable despite the obvious economic differences that separated their daily experiences. Jonas was stunned by this unexpected development and the radical transformation in Selene's presentation of herself. He had expected additional corporate damage control measures, perhaps legal discussions about non-disclosure agreements and privacy policies, or possibly even termination for his role in creating negative publicity around the viral video incident. But he certainly had not anticipated this humble, personal gesture from someone who inhabited such a different social stratum from his own working-class existence. "I've spent the past 4 days thinking about everything you said during our meeting," Selene continued, her voice trembling slightly with nervous sincerity that replaced the confident authority that typically characterized her business communications. "You were absolutely right about everything. I failed to protect your daughter when she needed protection most, and I let corporate excitement override basic human decency and responsibility." She paused, struggling to find words that could adequately convey the depth of her regret and the fundamental changes in perspective that witnessing Ivy's authentic compassion had created within her carefully guarded heart. "But more than that, I've realized that I completely misjudged your family and your motivations. I was looking at you through the lens of my own experiences with people who had betrayed my trust, projecting suspicions and cynicism that had nothing to do with who you actually are or what you represent." Jonas remained silent, studying Selene's face for signs of manipulation or corporate strategy disguised as personal vulnerability. His protective instincts remained on high alert, but something in her demeanor, the absence of expensive jewelry, the simple clothing, the genuine emotion in her voice suggested that this conversation was fundamentally different from their previous corporate encounter. "I saw your daughter helping someone in our building lobby," Selene continued, her voice growing stronger as she found ways to articulate the transformative experience that had shattered her assumptions about human nature and authentic goodness. "An elderly homeless man who needed assistance with social services paperwork. She spent 30 minutes helping him in Russian, treating him with the same respect and cultural sensitivity that she showed to our Korean business partners. No cameras, no audience, no recognition or reward, just pure compassion for someone who needed help." The tears that had begun during her observation of Ivy's interaction with Victor returned as Selene remembered the profound impact of witnessing authentic human goodness in action. "I realize that your daughter's remarkable abilities aren't tools for personal advancement or social climbing. They're expressions of a generous spirit that wants to help people connect and understand each other across every kind of barrier. And I understood that I had been seeing your family through the distorted lens of a world that taught me to question everyone's motives, instead of recognizing genuine goodness when it was right in front of me. Jonas felt his defensive anger beginning to soften as he recognized the sincerity in Selini's voice and the obvious effort she had made to approach their conversation as equals, rather than maintaining the corporate hierarchy that had characterized their previous interactions. The woman sitting across from him in simple clothes, speaking with obvious vulnerability about her own failures and misconceptions, bore little resemblance to the intimidating executive who had initially dismissed his family as inappropriate intrusions in professional environments. "What do you want from us?" Jonas asked quietly, his voice carrying both curiosity and continued wariness about the intentions behind this unexpected personal overture. Celine had spent hours preparing for this moment, but now found herself struggling to explain a proposal that challenged every assumption about appropriate boundaries between corporate executives and working-class employees. "I'd like to invite Ivy to participate in a volunteer program we're starting," she said carefully, her voice reflecting her understanding that this suggestion might be viewed with skepticism given their recent history of corporate exploitation and privacy violations. "Teaching English and cross-cultural communication to immigrant families who are trying to build new lives here in Seattle," she continued, watching Jonas's face for signs of interest or continued suspicion. "Not as a company representative or a publicity opportunity, but as someone who genuinely wants to use her extraordinary gifts to help others succeed in navigating the challenges of adapting to a different culture and language system." The proposal had been carefully crafted to respect Ivy's age and Jonas's parental concerns, while creating an environment where her abilities could flourish, without exploitation or inappropriate exposure to public attention. The volunteer program would be small, private, and focused entirely on service rather than recognition, advancement, or any form of corporate benefit that might compromise the authentic nature of Ivy's contributions. The program would meet once a week in a community center setting, Selini explained, her voice gaining confidence as she outlined the careful planning that had gone into protecting Ivy's privacy and well-being. Small groups of families who need language support, working with adult volunteers who can provide different kinds of expertise. Ivy would be one helper among many, not featured or highlighted in any way that might create the kind of attention that violated your family's privacy. Jonas studied Selini's face carefully, searching for hidden agendas or corporate calculations disguised as humanitarian concern. But the sincerity in her trembling voice, the humility in her posture as she sat uncomfortably on a cheap plastic chair in his basement workplace, and the obvious effort she had made to approach them without the symbols of wealth and authority that had initially intimidated him, began to create space for the possibility that this offer might be genuine. "I need to talk with Ivy about this," Jonas said slowly, his protective instincts still demanding caution even as he began to believe that Selini's transformation might be authentic rather than strategic. At that moment, as if summoned by the mention of her name, Ivy appeared in the doorway of the break room. She had been spending her afternoon in the building's public lobby, helping elderly visitors navigate the complex directory system and occasionally translating for international business guests who needed assistance finding their appointments. Her small backpack still contained the German grammar workbook and Arabic writing practice sheets that had become as natural to her as breathing. "I would really like to help people learn English," Ivy said softly, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand the nature of Selini's proposal. Her voice carried the same gentle enthusiasm that had motivated her intervention during the merger crisis, the same compassionate desire to use her abilities for helping others overcome communication barriers that had characterized every interaction Jonas had witnessed throughout her young life. In those simple words, Jonas heard the unmistakable echo of his late wife Sarah's generous spirit and her fundamental belief in the importance of helping others whenever circumstances made such assistance possible. Sarah had always encouraged Ivy's curiosity about different cultures and languages, viewing her daughter's remarkable abilities as gifts that carried responsibilities for service rather than opportunities for personal advancement. The volunteer program began quietly 6 weeks later, meeting every Saturday morning in the community room of the Belltown neighborhood center, where immigrant families could access a variety of social services and educational opportunities designed to support their integration into American society. Rather than positioning herself as the CEO overseeing a corporate charitable initiative, Celine participated as a genuine volunteer, trading her expensive business attire for comfortable casual clothes that allowed her to work directly with families who needed practical assistance. The transformation in Celine's approach to human relationships was remarkable to observe. She had spent years perfecting the art of maintaining professional distance and emotional control, but now she found herself laughing with grandmothers who shared stories about their home countries, helping fathers navigate employment application processes, and discovering the simple joy that came from using her business skills to help others achieve their goals rather than advancing her own career objectives. Ivy approached each teaching session as an adventure, finding creative ways to make language learning enjoyable and accessible for students of all ages and educational backgrounds. Her natural empathy allowed her to understand the emotional challenges that accompanied the practical difficulties of learning new languages, and she developed innovative techniques for helping families maintain their cultural identities while acquiring the English skills they needed for success in their adopted country. Other TechFlow Industries employees began joining the program voluntarily, creating a growing community of people who wanted to contribute something meaningful beyond their regular job responsibilities. The initiative became a bridge between the corporate world and the broader Seattle community, demonstrating that successful businesses could serve purposes beyond profit generation without compromising their competitive effectiveness. 8 months after that first humble conversation in the basement break room on a peaceful Sunday evening in late spring, Celine found herself being welcomed into Jonas and Ivy's small Belltown apartment for dinner. The invitation represented a milestone that none of them had explicitly acknowledged, but all deeply understood the recognition that their relationship had evolved from corporate encounter to something approaching genuine family connection. She arrived wearing a simple cotton dress and carrying only a modest bottle of wine and a small bouquet of flowers from Pike Place Market, having long since abandoned the expensive accessories and designer clothing that had once defined her public identity. The apartment radiated warmth and authenticity that no amount of money could purchase or interior designer could create artificially. Ivy's language books and cultural maps filled makeshift bookshelves constructed from boards and concrete blocks, while her artwork decorated the refrigerator alongside family photographs that showed the journey of love, loss, and gradual healing that had shaped their lives. The space was small but filled with evidence of intellectual curiosity, creative expression, and the kind of authentic love that transformed modest surroundings into something that felt like home. They sat around the small kitchen table that served as dining room, workspace, and family gathering place, with Ivy positioned between her father and Celine as she worked on a new composition that combined English and Korean vocabulary in ways that would help her volunteer students remember important phrases more effectively. The conversation flowed naturally between serious discussions of international politics and cultural differences, lighthearted exchanges about Seattle's unpredictable weather, and shared stories from their volunteer work with immigrant families. Celine found herself contributing perspectives based on her business experience, while learning about neighborhood dynamics and family relationships that had remained invisible to her during years of executive focus on quarterly reports and strategic planning initiatives. Jonas shared insights about building maintenance and mechanical systems while discovering that corporate decision-making involved human complexities that he had never previously considered or understood. As candlelight flickered across their faces, and comfortable conversation continued around the modest dinner table. Selene realized that she had finally found what she had been searching for without knowing it existed. Not professional validation or social recognition, but the simple joy of belonging to a family that valued authenticity over appearance, genuine connection over material achievement, and mutual support over competitive advantage. Jonas felt his heart opening in ways he had not experienced since Sarah's death, recognizing that his feelings for Selene were based on genuine affection and shared values, rather than loneliness or financial desperation. He had found someone who could love both him and Ivy without reservation or calculation, someone whose transformation from corporate executive to caring family member had demonstrated the possibility of authentic change and growth. Ivy, with the intuitive understanding that young people often possess about human relationships and emotional authenticity, recognized that she had gained something precious that went beyond additional language practice or volunteer opportunities. She had found a maternal figure who would love and support her unconditionally while respecting the memory of her biological mother and the special relationship she shared with her father. As the evening drew to a close and they cleaned dishes together in the small kitchen, sharing the domestic routines that bind families together across differences of background and experience, three people who had been incomplete in different ways discovered that they had somehow found their way to wholeness together. They had created a family built on authentic love, mutual respect, and shared commitment to caring for each other through whatever challenges and joys the future might bring to their unlikely but genuine partnership. The story that had begun with corporate crisis and linguistic miracle had evolved into something far more significant, a testament to the transformative power of authentic human goodness and the possibility that people from completely different worlds could find their way to each other when they had the courage to see beyond surface differences, to recognize the universal needs for love, understanding, and belonging that connect all human hearts. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.